a time span of nearly 68 years that extends from the horse and buggy days until the present space age. This story begins at 3114 Euclid Avenue in Sioux City, Iowa on February 21st, 1914, with a Dr. Hubbard attending. A bouncing baby boy was born to my father and mother on that day. My first memories of my own life was being very sick and having a doctor there trying to tap my water. I suppose I'd had some kind of a kidney trouble or something. But as my mother and father told me later, I was a very sick boy. And I suppose I must have been somewhere near 2 years old because I can remember learning to walk again. I can remember the terrifying incident of the chloroform or ether that they used to put me under, because I had a nightmare, sort of a dream of a spiral, a real fiery spiral, and I was sliding down through the middle of that spiral and just sinking into oblivion. It's something that terrified me for years. I could remember that is a bad experience. We had a cement sidewalk in front of our place that went down the hill from on Euclid Avenue, and it ended at people by the name of Bronson down at the foot of the hill. And from there, it was a wooden sidewalk up to the Bronson's place. This was a dead-end street that went down to the Floyd River, stopped down there. I had a pair of iron roller skates, the old clamp-on type. I suppose they bought me this as a exercise deal to get me to use my legs more, but I became quite good on those roller skates, especially down that hill. It didn't work too good coming back up the hill, but I had got so I could make pretty good time going down the hill. These Bronsons had lived down at the end of the road, at the end of the street, had a little brown dog, and that dog had died about that time. And this bothered me very much. I remember looking under the wooden sidewalk, under Bronson's porch, and any place I could think of to look to see if I couldn't find that dog and bring him back again. Guess I really didn't understand the question of, or the big deal of death. The neighbors that lived across the street from us, his name was Plukoff, and he had a son, Paul. And I used to play with that son quite a bit. And in our picture collection that we have here, someplace there's a picture of myself and that Paul Plukoff in our little old uniforms that Mother made us, which was short-legged pants with a bib in the back and two straps going up over the shoulder, sort of a jumper thing that all the people of our caste or social status wore. The neighbor to the west of us, his name was Rice. The neighbor to the east of us was a Hanson. Next to Hanson's was a Sterkel, and then Bronson's down at the end of the road. My Uncle Bob drove an ice wagon in Sioux City at that time. An ice wagon was somewhat like a dray wagon with a big van body on it, a wooden top, wooden body, and they'd carry big cakes of ice in the back of this, and they would drive through the neighborhood, and when anybody needed ice in their ice box, they'd chip off a chunk and bring it in to put in your ice box. And it was quite a thing for all the kids in the neighborhood to go running after these ice wagons and grab the chips of ice. And then we'd put them in their mouth, which was a very good treat on a hot summer day. After years later, I used to wonder just where that ice came from, if they got it out of a river or didn't seem to bother us much at that time. We used to ride. My dad was a streetcar conductor, and Mother used to take the kids down to the corner, the nearest corner where Dad's streetcar went by, which was probably 4 or 5 blocks away. And she would ride uptown, then leave the kids on the streetcar with Dad while she went about her business uptown. And this was quite an adventure. I enjoyed this part of it very much. We'd ride back and forth in the streetcar until Mother would show up at the stop with her packages, and we'd all get on the streetcar and ride back to the corner. Everybody carried packages to go back home again. And sometime in the summer, I think it was in the summer of 1919, I had gone out on the farm to stay with my grandpa. But before, I better back up a little bit here to the winter of 1918. I can remember the flu epidemic very well. When someone would die in a house, they would hang a black wreath on the door of that house. There were a lot of black wreaths around. And the streetcars during that winter, then, as a precautionary move, they had removed all the windows from the streetcars. So there was no heat. They were very cold, with the assumption that the flu was a very contagious disease and they wouldn't spread it quite so rapidly if the people weren't in an enclosed streetcar. Whether it helped or not, I don't know. But I do know that an awful lot of people died. Then, the summer then of 1919, I went out to Grandpa's farm. I spent part of the summer out there. My cousin Darrell Holcomb was there too, part of the time. Between the two of us, I think we caused Grandpa and Grandma Patterson a great deal of worry and heartaches. One incident, Darrell and I had gone out to behind the barn when Grandpa was out in the field, and there was a cement stave silo out there. Well, we'd started climbing up on those iron rings that go around the outside of the silo, which they had put all the joints in one place. Well, we'd climbed and climbed. I guess we weren't looking down, we were just looking up, and it kept on climbing till we got to the top. And then we were sitting on the blocks. There was no roof on the silo. We were sitting on the blocks up at the top edge, and Grandma spied us. Well, Grandma became very terrified, and she ran out to the field to get Grandpa to bring him back, show him where the boys were. Well, we were a little bit reluctant to come down, I suppose, or maybe we were too afraid to come down or didn't know how. But anyhow, Grandpa wound up climbing up through the chute to the top of the silo and getting these boys one at a time and taking us back down off of the silo and then paddling our little bottoms, which I guess we'd thoroughly earned. Grandpa also had made me a hobby horse. This is after my cousin Darrell had gone home. And a hobby horse is a stick with a wood horse head carved, put on the end of the stick, and then you have a pair of reins, and you ride that horse. You can get as much speed as the rider is capable of. I was playing a little game with my grandpa in the house, running through the doors, and he would chase the horse with a fly swatter and laughing and having a real good time, when my horse must have stumbled and threw me because my head hit the woodwork at the base of one of these doors and cut my head open. Well, I guess there was quite a discussion between Grandpa and Grandma at that time, and probably a good scare, and there was a lot of blood, and I was thoroughly scared too, and to this day yet I carry the scar on the side of my head where I'd hit that uh, trim on the side of that door and cut it open. Another thing I remember is helping my grandmother gather corn cobs out of the hog pen. You would feed the hogs ear corn. Grandpa would shovel it out there to them. And there was always a big pile of corn cobs out there that the hogs had eaten the corn off them. These corn cobs were very good fuel for cooking and for using in the cook stove for baking bread and, well, any other thing, and actually for heating houses too. But I'd go out there with Grandma and help her gather up these corn cobs, which I thought was just a good time, but I suppose to my grandmother it must have been quite a tiring chore because it had to be done every day. We had Grandpa also had some Tamworth hogs or Arkansas Razorbacks. They were the hogs with very long snoots and very mean dispositions. And he had a couple of these sows who he had separated from the rest of his hogs, and these sows was in a smaller pen in an apple orchard, and they each had litters of pigs. Grandpa had cautioned me never go out in there because those sows were very dangerous and very vicious. Well, a small kid don't always remember everything his grandfather told him, so one day I saw these sows laying down out there and in the sun, the little pigs up alongside of them, and the sows singing to the pigs. So I wanted to pick up one of them little pigs and pet him. So I went up there very softly and reached over and picked up one of them pigs to pet him, but the pig evidently didn't see it that way because he squealed, and the old sow jumped up, both of them, and took after me. But fortunately, there was an apple tree right there, and I climbed up the apple tree, screaming at the top of my lungs, and the sows were barking at me, and Grandpa's old dog was raising a rumpus, and Grandma come out to see what the problem was. She again had to go out in the field to get Grandpa to come in, and well, he got a square crate that he would use with no bottom in it, and he would walk in that and bring the crate along with him so that he was protected from all sides, because these sows really were vicious when they were riled. And he came out there with a club and the dog with him, fighting those sows off to rescue me out of that apple tree. Fortunately, the rescue was successful, because I'm still here yet. Another big incident in the summer of 1919 was the first Madison family reunion, which was my grandmother and my grandmother Madison and all of my dad's brothers and his sister and all of their families all went to Minnesota. We rode the train up there, and we spent, I think, probably a week, maybe 2 weeks, at two farms up in Minnesota, one near Kenneth, where my Uncle Raleigh lived, and another near Rushmore, where my Uncle Will lived. All the male relatives went down to a pond that my Uncle Raleigh had. He built a dam in the San Pepadan Creek in Cushing, and near Kenneth. And he had a pond there for his cows to drink in. Well, all the males stripped off their clothes and they made a seine out of gunny sacks and a couple of poles. They were in there seining, and they were getting crawdads and bullheads out of that pond. And some of the guys were in there just dipping around and wading and swimming, and I decided that that was for me. I wanted to do this, and I did a little bit of whining about it. My father had told me that no, not the small kids. But I hadn't learned yet, I guess. I still insisted I want to come in. Well, my father wasn't one to stand around and listen to a lot of whining and griping. So he come up out of the creek and just grabbed me, clothes and all, and threw me in. Well, I guess it was a little deeper than he anticipated because I sunk. And everybody then put on a frantic search, I guess, to try to find me and fish me out. That's the day I learned to swim. I'd come up out of there, and even with pants and shoes on, I found out that I could swim. And I enjoyed it for years after that. Part of the vacation or the family picnic was spent down at my Uncle Will's farm down near Rushmore. And they had a couple of riding horses there. That was my first experience riding a horse. I remember the horse's name was Old Dewey. And my cousin Floyd, he was sort of the keeper of the horse, and he's the one that take all the small kids, and we took a lot of pictures there at that family reunion. And among our pictures, we have some of the whole gathering. We have some of, I think, 7 kids at one time, all on that old horse Dewey. It was really one of the good times of our lives. We still hold that family reunion annually. Usually hold it down at Worthington, Minnesota now. Then later on, in 1919, my dad quit the streetcar business, and we moved out to my grandfather's farm. My grandfather moved into Cushing. This is my grandfather Pattison. And he built a new house right near where they had built a new schoolhouse. Our neighbors out there on this farm, when we first moved out there, were Jorns on the adjoining farm. But the Jorns had originally came from Chicago. And he was one of the few guys around there that had a motor vehicle. Well, Bill Jorn had an old International truck. And they used that for a car. They didn't hardly ever go anywhere with a horse and buggy. Most of our traveling was done with a horse and buggy. But when a car would come down the old road past the farm, it was quite an event. You'd hear a car coming, and some of the kids would holler, "Hey, here comes a car, automobile." And everybody'd run out to the road and watch when that car went by. And we, of course, knew all the cars in the country because there weren't very many cars. Some of the names of the cars is a Script Booth, and a Scranton, and a Chandler. And then my grandfather had a car. The first one he had was an old Kissel. Then he'd got a more modern one. It was a little 4-cylinder Buick. And the first car that my dad had bought was Saxon, a big old Saxon touring car. It was the same car that my Uncle John, who was married in 1919, had taken on his wedding trip. He'd gone out to Estes State Park in the state of Colorado. And later on, when he came back, my dad had bought that car. That was our first motor vehicle. A lot of good things and fun things happened while we lived there on that farm. I remember we had a dog. We'd got him as a puppy, and of course he was my constant companion. And either the dog was very smart, because I don't recall trying to train him. But we had one cow, her name was Susie, and she was an easy milking cow, and of course no refrigeration or anything. If you needed milk sometime through the day, especially if the milk had gone sour, then the thing to do was go get a cow and milk a little milk out of that cow. Well, this was a job that fell to old Spot and I. We went out in the pasture, through the first pasture, which had both hogs and cattle. Then we had a jump over with a little gate that would slide. It was two 2x4s that slide through notches. And Spot went with me enough times to go down and get old Susie that he knew the routine better than I did. And he would grab that bottom of that 2x4 and growl and pull on it. Finally, he was opening that jump over all by himself. He'd go out and herd the cows and pick out Susie, drive Susie back through the jump over, close the gate, and we'd bring her up to the house, or Mom or one of the kids after we learned the business, to milk some milk out of old Susie so we had some for the house. That another little incident with that dog that happened while we lived there on that farm was one day Esther and I were, my sister, next one younger than I, were sitting near a boardwalk that run from the house down to the driveway. At the end of the boardwalk was an iron gate, a little swinging gate. And Esther and I were sitting there, and we'd had scraped up the dirt and made little roads, and we had little wooden cars and vehicles and people, and we were very busy playing on that. And first I noticed old Spot. He was very tense, and he was whining a little bit, and his ears were perked up. And I was just looking at him, wondering what was the matter with my dog, and I heard that iron gate click behind me, and I looked around, and here was the biggest, roughest hobo I had ever seen come through the gate, and he was walking right toward me. Well, at first I was petrified. I was too scared to say or do anything. The first thing I could think of to say or do was sick him. Well, old Spot, he took off like a shot, and he nailed that hobo, and of course the hobo was trying to fight him off and hollering and cursing, and he run back through the gate, and Spot chased him clear out onto the road. The hobo was running down the road, and Spot was nailing him in the seat of the pants about every third jump. And of course Mother came out. She heard the dog barking and the screaming and the hollering, and she run back in the house then and grabs the old wall telephone. That was a party line. Everybody in the neighborhood was all on the same line, and you each had a different ring. But when you'd ring several long rings at one time, that's what they'd call a general ring, and then everybody on the line would pick up their phone and see what the important message was. And of course, in this instance, the message was that there was a hobo coming down the road. Everybody be on the lookout for him. So the poor old hobos, you wonder how they got anything to eat. Another incident that happened with a hobo while we were living there is the kids were in the house one day, and Mother too. Dad was out in the field. It was in corn cultivating time, so it had to be sometime in July or August. And Dad had a policy that any hobo or anybody that came there begging food, you always feed them. You don't send anybody away hungry. So Mother saw the hobo coming, and she'd hook the hook on the screen door, and a couple of kids looking around her skirts, and this hobo came up and asked for something to eat. So Mother told him to wait right there, and she went back in the kitchen and made a sandwich. And my folks drank Postum instead of coffee. I never did care for the stuff myself, but she had a pot on the stove, so she poured him a cup of hot Postum and the sandwich and took him out, made him get away from the screen door, and set the sandwich and the cup of Postum down on the step, hooked the screen door again, and then he picked him up and took a few bites out of his sandwich, then took a sip of what I suppose he thought was going to be coffee. but when he tasted it, it was that Postum. He wasn't a very well-mannered guy because he hollered and cursed and threw the hot Postum back through the screen door onto my mother, and of course she hollered a little bit. But Dad, in the meantime, had hitched the horses to the fence post and come up through the orchard to the grove on the north side of the house to come up to get a drink of water. And he was coming around the corner of the house about the time that hobo was cursing and threw that Postum through the screen door. Well, when the hobo finally got away, he didn't look so good. But he had been pretty well beaten up by my father, and which my father could do in no uncertain terms. These Porter boys that lived next to us, there were 3 of them. They were about the same age as myself and my 2 brothers who were older than I, Squint and Elmer. And, we used to dream up all sorts of things to get into. And me being the youngest, whenever there was any dirty work to be done, I usually got elected because I didn't have anybody to pass the chore on to. So on Halloween night, we'd walked out up the road to a widow woman who lived up there. Her name was Mrs. Van Horn, a very old lady. She had a kind of a ramshackle house, and right across the road from her house was a schoolhouse, which was no longer used. Of course, it didn't take long for the imagination to figure out that that schoolhouse was haunted, and so was her house, and that she was an old witch. So on Halloween night, the boys' thoughts turned to Mrs. Van Horn. And we went up there to her place, where the plan was to stick a table knife under the clapboards on the side of her house, and then snap the handle back and let it rattle against the clapboards. Well, the plan was pretty good. We were going to pull the knife with a string, while the rest of the recruits were hiding in the ditch along the road. Well, of course, we got up there, and you know who got elected to go up and put the knife under the clapboard. We had the string tied on it, but another problem developed. The string wasn't long enough to reach the ditch. So we had a little conference in the ditch there, and I was informed then to go back, that there was a shrub there in the middle of the yard, and that I should hide behind that shrub and pull the string. So I did this, and the knife rattled against the clapboards in pretty good style. Mrs. Van Horn came out hollering, "Who's there? Who's there?" not seeing anybody. She'd gone back in her house again, and I went back to the ditch to have another conference. Was informed that you go back and pull it again, so I did. This time when Mrs. Van Horn came out, she had a pistol, and she was fired a few rounds with that pistol, I suppose up in the air. I can remember seeing the fire flash out of the end of that barrel in the dark, but I wasn't waiting around to see how many shots she fired or which way they were going, because I heard feet pounding down the road, and I think I passed them all. They had a little head start on me, but we did get down the road in good time. Another one of our adventures, we had a neighbor named Julian who had just moved in there. Of course, some stories had circulated about Julian, that they kidnapped kids and all this. I don't know who started all these stories, but they would get started. The Julians were quite an old couple, and they didn't have any children of their own. But old Sam and Mandy, they were very nice people. You got to know them. We'd also went down to their place, and the plan there was we was going to go up and rap on their door and then run before anybody could come to the door. Well, of course, I got elected again to go up there and rap on the door, which I did. I rapped on the door, and taken off, and I thought I heard the door snap a little bit, but nobody came back, so nobody came out of the door, so I said, well, go up and do it again, you know. So I went back up there, and I just rap on the door when the door opened, and oh, Mr. Julian grabbed me, and he had me. Of course, there was some shrieking and hollering out where the rest of the recruits were, and again the feet were pounding down the driveway, but I was inside terrified at first until I saw the old gentleman, and he was laughing, and his wife were laughing, and they were making some homemade ice cream. We were turning the old ice cream freezer. Well, that looked quite interesting there, so I joined in on turning the ice cream freezer and got pretty well acquainted with the people, and they had cantaloupes. They had split the cantaloupes open, and my first experience was eating a cantaloupe with ice cream in it. It was very good. Pretty soon the telephone rang, and here was my poor old mother. The boys had run home and told her that I had been kidnapped. So she had called to Julian's house to see if they'd seen the guy there. Yeah, they had saw me. Well, that's the way my folks got acquainted with the Julians. We became quite good friends after that. We had a lot of cantaloupes, watermelons, and old Sam, he loved hollyhocks. And his place in the summertime was just wild with blooms of hollyhocks. Of course, a lot of other flowers. I don't remember if it was this same summer or the following summer, but we played back and forth with the Porter boys quite a bit. And one night, the older brothers decided that they were going to go over to Porter's and play after they got their chores done, but they hadn't told me about it, so I didn't start with my chores right away. And they'd finished up their chores and informed me that they were going over to Porter's to play. Well, of course, I appealed to my mother to make them wait for me. Well, if I couldn't get my chores done on time, they were going to go. So, well, they went. I had to finish doing my chores. After I got done, it was dark already, and I went to tell my mother that I was going to go over to Porter's too. And she said, well, she didn't like to have me walking over there alone in the dark. I just didn't seem to have much fear of the dark. I informed her that I was going to go anyhow. So she said, all right, I could go ahead, but she was going to call the other boys and tell them to meet me. So she called over to the Porter's place and informed them to come and meet me, that I was on my way over. Well, I was going down the road at a pretty good clip, and I could hear the boys all coming over a hill that was between our place and Porter's. Not a very big hill, but it was high enough so that there was a culvert down at the bottom of the hill, and I could hear the guys talking. And they was saying, let's hurry up and get down to the culvert, and we'll hide in there and scare him before he gets here. So, it was a big surprise to these boys. I was almost at the culvert already when I heard this. So I trotted down to the end of the big culvert. It was big enough so I could stand up in it, so it was a pretty good sized culvert. And I run into the middle of this culvert, and I'm in there when the culprits came, and were coming in from both ends of the culvert and giggling and laughing at how they were going to scare me. And by the time they got partially in there, I let out a blood-curdling scream, and oh, it was a terrible commotion. Those guys went out of that culvert and down the road. 2 boys went toward our house. 3 went toward Porter's house. And I got out of the culvert, of course, and I was rolling there and laughing in the ditch and waiting for them to cool down. I suppose I envisioned them running a little ways and then coming back, but they'd gone a little further than that. They'd run all the way home and informed my dad and mother that there was some wild beast in that culvert and that he'd gotten me and eaten me. Well, first thing I see was a lantern coming from our place. Then I see another one coming over the hill from the Porter's place. Porter boys had gone home and told their folks pretty much the same story. Well, I had quite a time explaining to my dad and to Mr. Porter that there wasn't any wild beast there, that it was me doing the screaming. And of course I was in trouble again. But the worst thing that happened to the whole deal was that my brother Elmer had crapped his pants. And the blood-curdling scream that came out of that culvert. It was in the fall of 1920 that I started the school. And the school had been consolidated. That is, everybody went to town to school. And the big new schoolhouse built up on the hill didn't contain a first grade. And I think probably the second grade too. They had two of the little old country wooden schoolhouses that they had moved in and pulled together. And this was where the first grade went to school. That's where I had my first romance down there. An awful cute little girl by the name of Laura Kraler. That was my heartache. I loved her something fierce. The schoolhouses were heated with the big old cast iron stoves with an iron jacket around it. That is the first and second grade schoolhouses. But later on, then we went up to the hill to the bigger schoolhouse. I think I just went to the first grade down there in that small schoolhouse. The buses that we rode were horse-drawn school buses. Was not a factory-built wagon at all. It was, I suppose, designed by some local carpenter or artisan. They were built on a high-wheeled wagon. They were made out of wood, and you got in them in a door from the back. They had a top on them, and plank benches run down each side, and the kids sat on the plank benches with your feet in the box in the middle. The driver had a seat up front with a hole in there for the lines to stick through. There was a little iron stove under the floorboards right up near the driver. That was the only heat in there, and it wasn't too effective. I know in the cold winter time you could probably hear these buses coming before you could see them, from the kids all stamping their feet in unison on the wooden floor trying to keep their feet warm. I rode this type of a bus for, I guess for at least the first year. And after that they had pretty much the same kind of a body mounted on a Model T Ford truck. And we have a picture someplace among our pictures here of one of them old wooden-bodied Model T buses right out in front of our place. My sister Blanche had got herself a camera by selling garden seeds, and it was the box camera, and it had a pack of film. Each time you'd take a picture, you'd pull the front film up and tear it off. Then when you got them all torn off, you'd send a pack in and get them reprinted. But a great many of the pictures that we have in this box of old pictures here were taken with that camera while we lived on that farm out there near Cushing. The threshing was done with Charlie Bruni had a big old oil pull Rumley tractor. It looked very big to me at that time. I suppose it wasn't one of the biggest ones, but you'd have a crew would go from one farm to the other, using this big old oil pull Rumley tractor to run the thrash rig. Iowa was a corn country too, and the corn shelling was done pretty much that same way. A group of neighbors would get together and go from one farm to the other and shell the corn. And our neighbor Bill Bowman, he was the corn sheller. He had a Hyder tractor, and he had a spring corn sheller, or a cylinder corn sheller. That was the first cylinder corn sheller around there. Before that, they were a spring sheller with a hole in them. They didn't shell corn quite as fast as the old cylinder sheller, but to this day, yet the cylinder sheller hasn't changed a whole lot from what they were then. It was in the summer of 1921. It was sometime in the spring of the year when a storm had gone through there, and it blew down one of our apple trees. And I had watched my dad chop wood and swing that axe and take big chips out of a tree with it. Well, that apple tree blew down. I thought this was a chance for me to be a big lumberjack, so I took a corn knife. Now, a corn knife is a long, heavy knife. It's probably about 2 feet or 30 inches long, and it's used for chopping corn stalks. It's quite a heavy knife, and it has a wooden handle on the end. Well, I was barefooted, and I went out there and I stood straddle of this apple tree, and little branches about the size of your finger, I'd swing that up over my head like a big lumberjack swinging an axe. I chopped one of them little twigs off and went right on down through and right through my foot with a corn knife. Well, it had stormed. There was mud all over, so of course I see that all that blood, and I start on the run through that mud up to the house. Of course, Elmer got in the house ahead of me, screaming to my mother that I had cut my foot. My mother was a very tender-hearted person. She couldn't stand the sight of blood. Well, she took one look at all that blood in that foot. She got a pan and washed some of the mud off. Then she had to stop that bleeding, so she grabs a big handful of flour and stuffed that into my foot, and then she fainted. Well, that kind of terrified everybody. Dad wasn't in the house. Elmer got on the telephone then and called up Mrs. Porter. Mrs. Porter weighs about 300 and some pounds, and it's about a quarter of a mile from Porter's over to our place. And old Bertha Porter run that distance. By the time she got over there, she was too exhausted to really do much of anything. But in the meantime, Blanche had the presence of mind to put a little water on my mother and on her head, so my mother had came to again by the time Bertha got over there. But it was quite an exciting time. And this was earlier in the summer. In the meantime, a year or so before that, my grandmother Pattison had died. And this was my first experience with death in the immediate family. It was quite a shocking thing to me. But in the meantime, my grandfather, story has it, had a schoolhood sweetheart, and that they had split up in a lover's quarrel, and that he had married my grandmother on the rebound. Well, after my grandmother had died, the following summer, Grandpa had gone down and back to Ohio, and he had married this girl. She had never married, and her name was Delia Macklin. But she had been a nurse, so she took on the chore of nursing me and taking care of my foot. And I was healing up fairly well until the 4th of July, when we had a kind of a neighborhood gathering. It was at our place. All the neighbors come over, and you have pumpkin pie and your fireworks, and you pretty well make your own fun. Well, I did a lot of running around that day, and my foot wasn't completely healed yet, but it had scabbed over and was well on the road to healing. But that night, I got a terrible throbbing pain in my foot, in my leg. And as soon as it was daylight, my dad loaded me up in the